My son Cade is smart. He's only 6 years old, halfway through the first grade, and he's already begun reading books that even I struggle to get through. He's a sharp kid, but he has some quirks. And listen, all kids have quirks. One thing I've learned as a relatively new father is that kids are weird. They talk to the walls, eat bugs, see things in the reflection that aren't there. You get the gist. Kids really do the darndest things. But recently, my son has reached a new level of oddity. One that is out of my jurisdiction as the oblivious goofball dad who still makes hot dogs for every meal. I became a single parent after my wife passed a few years back. It's been impossibly difficult. I won't sugarcoat it. Being the sole caretaker of Cade has been the single hardest thing I've ever had to do next to attending my wife's funeral. Cade, though he was only 4 at the time, took his mother's passing hard. He would ask for her constantly, throwing wild fits, thrashing around like a fish out of water. At any minor inconvenience, he would be lagrimoso. I didn't know how to handle it. He'd often throw tantrums in public, wailing like a banshee in Home Depot as passers-by would stare with judgment spilling out of their wide eyes. I felt utterly helpless. All I could do was attempt to calm him in a hushed tone, promising that Daddy was there to help him. But Daddy was not enough. Every child needs their mother. I remember wishing I had the funds to take Cade to see a child psychologist or at least a licensed medical professional. I work in construction and barely make enough to pay each month's rent, let alone provide health care for my poor son. Looking back now, I should have downsized so I could afford it. Cade's explosive fits continued until about a few months ago. These tantrums would occur every other day, if not daily. Then, suddenly, they dwindled to once a week. Then after another month, none at all. I was relieved, to say the least. It was a weight off my chest to avoid the pointed glares from strangers on the street as I'd haul a hysterical Cade into the car, practicing the patience I didn't know I had until fatherhood. But once Cade's meltdown ceased, a new issue presented itself, one that scared me far more than any tantrum I've seen him throw: imaginary friends. I know what you're thinking. Every kid has imaginary friends. And you're right. But Cade's imaginary friends were a little bit different. He called them the audience. It began one night during dinner when I had the bright idea to saute some spinach alongside boiling the usual hot dogs in hopes Cade would get his greens in somehow. I scooped a heap onto his plate and placed it in front of him, beckoning him to try. "It's good," I said, feigning a smile. "Popeye eats it to get big and strong." Cade looked at the plate, quizzically, looked at me, and looked back at the plate. He sat there for a while, staring the spinach down as if were the innards of an alien creature. He looked at me again as if I might be crazy, then pushed the plate away. "No, thank you." "Cade," I said warningly, my dad voice making an appearance. "You have to at least try it." Cade made a humming noise, as if pondering this deeply, and began to stroke his chin. "I'm not sure," he had said, finally. "Let me ask the audience." Cade turned to face a window next to the kitchen table. The window faced our backyard. Though dusk had long since departed, the outside world was dark as doom. My son, staring out into a window of nothingness, appeared as if he were simply looking at his reflection. The lights in the kitchen and the contrasting darkness outside created a mirror-esque effect. What do you think? There was deafening silence for a moment. I arched an eyebrow, waiting for the imaginary response from this mysterious audience. It was the first time I'd heard him mention them. I figured it was his new, foolproof method of avoiding any vegetable consumption that evening. After a moment too long, Cade turned back around to face me. They said no. I scoffed and gestured to his plate once more. I'm sure they did. Now, go on. Have a bite. No, I can't. I'm not allowed, he said again. Cade, knock it off. Please eat your spinach. No, Daddy. They said no. I had assumed he would whine like he usually did when he didn't get his way. But this time, his tone sounded different. Desperation clung to his voice as if he were begging me to understand. I dropped it. I was too tired to fight him. He went to bed with a belly full of hot dogs unaccompanied by sautéed spinach. Unfortunately, the audience wasn't as easy to get rid of as a plate of boiled hot dogs. The following week, Cade's imaginary friends made an appearance once again. I was trying to get Cade in his pajamas for bedtime. The usual routine went pajamas, teeth brushing, bedtime story, lights out. Always the same order. But tonight was different. Cade decided to brush his teeth before changing into his pajamas. "What about PJs, buddy?" I asked him, curious about his change in routine. He had been doing this bedtime routine the same way since before my wife passed. I imagined the routine was comforting to him, reminding him of when my wife was still around, which is why it was so odd that he had decided to switch things up suddenly. "The audience told me to do it this way now," he replied with a mouthful of toothpaste froth. There they were again, the audience. A sudden curiosity crept into my mind. Why? Cade glanced at his open bedroom window quickly. "I don't know. They just did." A sudden chill ran down my spine. I hadn't remembered those curtains being opened. Curtains are always closed before bedtime routine. I walked to the window and pulled them shut. After story time, when it was time for lights out, Cade refused to let me touch the light switch. "Dad, the audience wants the lights on." Cade cupped his tiny hands over the switch against his bedroom wall, creating a makeshift barrier, refusing to budge. I rolled my eyes. "Nice try, Cade, but the audience doesn't get to decide the rules." Fear flashed on Cade's face as he snapped his head to look at me, wide-eyed. "Don't say that, Daddy." His calm tone was eerie, and I took a step backward. "Cade, please, you can't stay up all night just because the audience told you to." "Yes, I can," Cade responded, his voice low. He was staring at the window, curtains closed and all. At this point, I was thoroughly unnerved, if I'm being honest. Something in my gut was telling me these imaginary friends were not very friendly. Not just an excuse to get out of vegetable eating, but an excuse for Cade to be up to no good. Even still, I had paternal duties to attend to. "Well, tell the audience to say goodnight." I scooped Cade into my arms despite his pleas and tiny fists of rage. I placed him gently on his bed and made my way towards his bedroom door, flicking the light switch off, signaling he had no choice in the matter. The lights in Cade's room remained on. I stopped in my tracks, spinning around, trying the switch once, twice, 3 times again. The lights didn't turn off. The switch must have been broken somehow, I thought. Despite my rational explanation for the phenomenon, the panic that began to bubble in my chest did not subside. "You're sleeping with me tonight." The next morning, the light switch started working again, and I was able to exhale the breath I hadn't realized I had been holding. But that feeling of relief didn't last long, as the week that followed was filled with even more peculiar coincidences. I say peculiar, but I think a more suited adjective would be horrifying. On Friday, Cade said the audience doesn't want him to go to school. I get a flat tire on my way to drop him off. On Monday, Cade says the audience doesn't like Jacob because he hogs the soccer ball during recess. On Tuesday, Jacob falls and breaks his arm. He'd be out of school for 2 weeks. On Thursday, Cade says the audience doesn't like Mr. Teddy, Cade's favorite stuffed animal, anymore. Mr. Teddy is found slashed open from the belly up, fluffy guts spilling from his abdomen. I began having trouble deciphering whether this was Cade's new method of acting out, or if there was really some ominous force at play. I could have rationed each occurrence away by blaming Cade, but I knew in my soul that Cade wasn't that kind of kid. He was sensitive and bright. He was no teddy bear killer. The audience began to infiltrate my thoughts, more than I would have liked it to. It was all Cade talked about, and more often than not, the audience would lead Cade down the path of destruction. Everything came to a head this past Saturday night while I used the bathroom, leaving Cade unattended in the living room watching an episode of his show. As I was washing my hands, I heard a loud crash, followed by a glass shattering. I ran to the living room and found Kate, looking guilty as ever, standing next to a wedding picture of my wife and me, glass scattered across the hardwood floor, smashed to bits. My instinctual response was to make sure he wasn't hurt, which, thank God, he wasn't. But afterward, an inexplicable anger coursed through me. Kate, why would you do something like that? It wasn't me. It was them. The Audi. Go to your room, I shouted, and Cade scurried up the stairs in tears. After a few minutes of feeling consumed with guilt, I started towards his room to apologize. I stood in front of the doorway for a moment, preparing myself for a long apology when I heard Cade's voice. He was talking to himself in his room. Well, he was speaking to someone, but I heard no response. But I don't want to do that, I heard him murmur. I love my daddy. I walked into Cade's room the second I heard him referring to me, and he looked spooked, like I had caught him with his hand in a cookie jar. He was positioned by the window, kneeling, facing the blackness of the night beyond. I could have sworn I saw something moving by the window, a figure cloaked by the lightless sky. Cade, I said slowly, who are you talking to in here? Cade didn't respond. Instead, he got to his feet, arms hanging by his sides, and dramatically flopped onto his bed, face pressed into the mattress. This was Cade talk for, get the hell out of my room. Though I was still fixated on the window, exposed by the open curtains, I snapped out of my trance to focus on my priorities. Cade, I say softly, Daddy is very sorry for yelling. Cade let out a humph, but kept his face against the mattress, refusing to look at me. Is there something you want to talk about? Maybe a reason why you're feeling sad? I tried to coax it out of him, but he wouldn't budge. It wasn't me, he had said, his voice muffled by the bedding. It was them. You didn't break that picture of Mommy and I? No, it was them. His voice cracked, and he lifted his face, tears spilling down his cheeks. They're everywhere, Daddy. I don't like them anymore. Who, Cade? Who is everywhere? Cade was practically choking on his sobs now. The audience. They told me that you don't like me anymore because Mommy died. They told me Mommy got sick and lost all her hair, and now she's in the ground. My chest seized up. Cade, who told you that? I had never told him his mother had gotten cancer. I rarely ever speak of her passing, for that matter. My wife and I had purposely sheltered him from the very end of her life, only allowing the happy memories to seep through the cracks of his memory. They did. They told me to open all the curtains so they could get you, Daddy. As much as I hate to admit it, at that moment I was terrified. I felt my heart rate spike as I watched my son dripping in saliva and salty tears, imagining phantom arms reaching through the window sills and dragging us into a never-ending nothingness. Sweetheart, I take a deep breath, attempting to steady my voice. There's no such thing as the audience. They're imaginary. They're not going to get either of us. You're safe and sound here with me. I pulled him into a hug, squeezing him tightly as if to show this audience they were not taking away my Cade. They're real, I heard him whisper, his head buried in my shoulder. That night, I lay with him in bed until he fell asleep. I was careful not to wake him as I kissed his rosy, tear-streaked cheeks goodnight, ensuring he was finally out. I felt at peace knowing he was tucked in bed, safe. I made my way downstairs to tidy up the kitchen, cleaning the pile of stray dishes left from dinner. I went over to the sink and began scrubbing. I had only gotten through maybe 3 or 4 when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I froze instinctively, fixating on the pan in the sink mid-scrub. There was something in the window, something my intuition was screaming at me not to look at. It was peeking at me, rising slowly into my peripheral vision. I felt the hairs on my arms rise, a chill running through me. Something was right in front of me, standing in front of the window. I couldn't bring myself to look. If I'm being completely honest, I was scared shitless. I could feel it staring at me, its eyes burning into the top of my head. I was afraid that if I acknowledged it, it would truly and entirely exist. In my motionless trance, I felt them begin to appear. They were all around me. Their presences, one by one, being made known in front of every window of the house. This was their debut. I could feel each one of my bones peering at first, then slowly rising in front of each open window in our home until they had reached their full length. Then they were all around me, staring at me through a thin sheet of glass. It was only a matter of time. I couldn't move, aside from my shaking hand still clutching that bubble-soaked pan in the kitchen sink. All I could think about was my son. Cade was still upstairs. I couldn't abandon him. These things had been tormenting him for weeks, and now was my chance to put a stop to it, to protect him. I knew I had only one option at this point. I sprang into action, launching myself from the kitchen sink and racing to my son's room. I saw them in the windows. They didn't move, didn't even flinch as I bounded up the stairs. They were colorless blurs as I ran past them, realizing then, and only then, that my house had far too many windows. I could make out some of their features, and honestly, I wish I hadn't. Their eyes bulged unnaturally so wide you could see the whites of them from top to bottom. And their mouths gaped open like the screen painting, far too wide for any human caliber, as if they had unhinged their jaws. Their skin was moist and pale and hairless, with swollen heads and skinny necks, bone-thin bodies, gawking at me with that fixed expression as if they were enthralled, captivated by the show. But there were no screams, none except for my own, of course. No sounds besides the thumping of my heart as it hammered into my chest. I nearly tore Cade's door off of his hinges, finding him sleeping peacefully in bed. That's where we've been for the past few hours, hiding under his covers, waiting for this nightmare to end, if it ever does. All I know is this: if your kid ever tells you they're talking to the audience, run. This is going to sound completely insane. I've been sitting on my phone for the past few hours trying to decide if I should even share this. The idea of it is so absurd, I can barely wrap my head around it. But if anything, I need to have some record of this experience if things take a turn for the worst. And they're starting to look pretty bad. It all started about a month ago. For some context, I live with my roommate in a small flat in Washington, D.C. I'm not home a whole lot because my job requires me to work upwards of 70 hours a week. I came home one night after a harrowing day of work. It was pretty late, and I thought my roommate was already asleep. I was fully prepared to do my nightly routine and hop right into bed. I unlocked the door to my apartment, set my keys on the kitchen counter, and opened the fridge to scarf down some leftovers from the day prior. I turned my back from the kitchen counter for not even a minute as I rummaged through the fridge, scouring each shelf for my Tupperware container of taco meat. Upon finally finding it, I turned back around to head towards the microwave and heat it up. But something caught my eye. There were now 2 sets of keys on the kitchen counter. No, that's not right, I thought to myself. I knew I had just put my keys on the empty kitchen counter. So how could another set have magically appeared? Was I so tired I was seeing double? I rubbed my eyes, but the replica keys remained, still next to mine, clear as day. I tried to rationalize it immediately. I'm a logical guy. I can always find an explanation for even the most absurd phenomena. I knew I didn't have any spare keys, despite my mother's constant instance that I made copies just in case. So how could another keychain, identical to the one I owned nonetheless, materialize next to mine in an instant? I figured my roommate had crept in behind me and placed his keys on the table next to mine. I was probably so exhausted I hadn't even heard him come in. Though this explanation made the most amount of sense, upon further inspection I realized the keys were an exact replica of mine. Right down to the Charmander keychain I had since I was a teenager. There were keys on this mysterious replica that I knew for a fact my roommate couldn't have had. For instance, I saw keys to offices in the building I worked at. The keys were even positioned the same way I had set them down. It looked as if someone had copied the exact placement of my keys and pasted it directly beside them on the counter. It was utterly impossible. But again, I insist that I was not an irrational man. Not then, at least. I knew this had to be some kind of prank. My roommate and I weren't close. He was a pretty peculiar guy with interests that differed from mine. We didn't interact much besides the occasional cordial greeting, but I never would have expected him to be smart enough to play a prank like this. It was odd, even for him. I continued to reason away, coming up with any plausible explanation for the duplication of my keys as I ate my dinner in silence and headed to bed. But I couldn't sleep that night. I tossed and turned and sweat through my sheets. I had known in my gut something wasn't right, but I had ignored it for the sake of my own sanity. The next morning, the cloned keys were gone. Only one pair remained on the kitchen counter. I breathed a sigh of relief, chalking it up to me being so sleep-deprived that I was imagining things. Boy, was I wrong. After about 2 weeks, I had honestly almost completely forgotten about the whole incident. That was until it happened again. This time, I had just gotten out of the shower on my one day off. It was Saturday, and I had decided to go for a quick run around the city for some exercise. I had arrived back at my apartment and taken my AirPods out to jump in the shower. I placed them on my dresser without a second thought before gravitating towards the bathroom to do my thing. About 15 minutes later, I leisurely made my way out of the bathroom, heading towards my dresser to throw on a pair of shorts and a t-shirt when I saw it. 2 AirPod cases lay before me, one right where I had left it and a duplicate right beside it. I had to bite back a scream. Where had the other case come from? How could I even discern the difference between the two? Which one belonged to me? I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the scene before me in disbelief. I even contemplated whether or not I was going cross-eyed. I imagined the horror of beginning to see double of singular objects. I eventually, tentatively reached a hand out to touch one of the cases to prove this theory, but I felt it in my hand. I felt them both in my hands. At the same time, that was when I decided something was seriously wrong. Now, what I did next, I can't provide an explanation for. I'm not sure what came over me. Perhaps it was sheer curiosity. Whatever it was a mistake. I had scrambled over to my bed, tearing away at the sheets and the comforter, to find my phone and ran back to the AirPod cases. I picked one of the cases up. At this point, I wasn't sure if I was picking up the duplicate or the original, but in hindsight, I'm assuming it was the duplicate. I stared at my phone and saw they were connected to the AirPods. I pressed play on a song I was all too familiar with, Kelly Clarkson. The music I heard coming from these AirPods, if you could even call it music, was not Kelly Clarkson Since You've Been Gone. No, this was what I can only describe as the most demonic sounds I had ever heard in my life. It was a chorus of screams, women, children, monstrous creatures wailing in agony and at a volume so loud I thought my eardrums had burst. It was similar to what I had imagined the depths of hell to sound like. I nearly smacked myself outside of the head trying to rip the AirPods out of my ears. I felt all the blood leave my body as my knees buckled beneath me. I couldn't move, I couldn't react, I couldn't even scream. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I was beginning to believe it was otherworldly. My sanity had fled me in a mere instant, and I had no idea what to do next. That evening, I contemplated checking myself into a mental hospital. The doppelganger AirPods had disappeared, but I had started to notice the clones of my belongings appearing more frequently. That same day, I had found 2 of the same ferns growing by my beside window when I knew I had only bought one. I tried to pour myself a glass of bourbon to calm my nerves and found 2 of the same limited edition Blood Oath Kentucky Straight bourbon bottles right beside each other. I had gotten only one as a gift on my 25th birthday. I even went to brush my teeth that night and found a replica of my same exact toothbrush, right down to the division of the bristles and the directions they were pointing in. I called out of work the next day and the following days after that. I couldn't function. I was living a life of dread, of trepidation. I was afraid to open my eyes. I was afraid to fall asleep. I felt as if I were going insane. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened tonight. I was holed up in the corner of my room, sitting at my desk, making a list of things that had duplicated themselves only to disappear in an instant. Throughout the course of the week, I had my laptop, my dresser, my picture frames, my pillows, and even my window duplicate themselves on more than one occasion. It had gotten to the point of being nearly inconvenient, if not inconceivably terrifying, specifically when my dresser had cloned itself right in front of the doorway to my bathroom. I hadn't had any contact with the outside world since the AirPod incident. Hadn't seen or spoken to a human being in fear of them seeing through my veiled mental deterioration. I hadn't eaten or slept. I knew I would die if I kept living like this. At one point, I heard the front door of my apartment swing open, followed by the muffled humming of my roommate as he made his way to his room. I knew he was my only chance at survival. He was the only other person I could cling to, that I could use as some token of normalcy, someone to keep me grounded. I ran to my bedroom door and flung it open. I raced to the kitchen and caught him just before he had laid a hand on his bedroom door. I was panting like a marathon runner and probably sweating like one too, but I didn't care. I didn't care about my appearance anymore, about how crazy I looked or about how crazy I was about to sound to him. I just needed someone to confide in. "Hey man, what's going on?" he said casually as he turned his attention to my hunched over form. His tone immediately changed from cordial to genuinely concerned. "Whoa, you okay?" I gasped, struggling to get the words out. "I have to talk to you about something that's been going on here." "Whoa, all right. Take it easy, man. Let's sit down for a second." He had put his hands in front of him gently and was talking to me as if he were trying to coax a rabid animal. I remember thinking his calm, cool tone was particularly out of character, given that, as I mentioned before, my roommate was a pretty odd guy and wasn't usually one to be great with social interactions. But at that moment in time, his level of emotional intelligence was of very little concern to me. "You have to listen to me," I tried to say, swallowing the saliva that had accumulated in my mouth. "There's something really wrong with this place. I keep seeing double." "Seeing double? Like you're too fucked up or something? Is that what you mean?" He stifled a laugh, clearly an attempt to lighten the mood, but I persisted. No. I keep seeing things appear, objects that are duplicating themselves." I knew how it sounded. I knew there was very little chance he would believe me, but I didn't care. I needed to find a solution. I needed to talk to someone about this. Anyone. "Dude, that's impossible." My roommate chuckled nervously. "Are you sure you're not just having some eye problems or something?" No. You're not listening to me." I was growing more and more agitated by the second. "I can feel them, too. The replicated objects. They're physically there. You have to understand." Suddenly, I saw something from behind my roommate, from behind his form. I saw movement. I know I did. I saw a figure. It was peeking at me from inside of his open bedroom door. Though it was dark, the only source of light coming from the kitchen, and it barely illuminated my roommate, let alone the area behind his large body. I saw it. I saw the glimmer of a black eye peeking at me from beyond him. It disappeared just as quickly as it appeared, as if it were snatched back into his room by an unseen force. I stared at my roommate with wild eyes. I pointed a shaky finger at him, ever so slowly. "Who are you?" I say, in a voice so low I almost didn't recognize it as my own. My roommate's face morphed from a concerned expression into one of sheer terror. What do you mean, man?" Silence rang in the air, and the tension was sharp enough to cut through steel. I stared at my roommate for God knows how long before I glanced once more at the doorway behind him just as the figure reappeared. I could only see half of its face, a dark, black eye, the corners of a mouth, and a long, slim nose. I couldn't see a discernible expression, but I knew in my gut that I could see just enough to recognize those features, the too long nose, the high cheekbones, the shaggy, greasy hair. I knew it was him. Or one of him, at least. It was my roommate. All I had to see after that was the movement of its mouth as it formed one word. "Run And that's just about what did it for me. I bursted into action, bolting towards the door and nearly ripping it off of its hinges as I threw myself into the hallway of our dingy apartment building. I raced down the hallway, pushing through the emergency exit doors and sprinting through the streets of DC, narrowly avoiding getting hit by a slew of cars on my way out. Yet, the entire time I could still hear them, the footsteps behind me. I didn't bother turning around. I ran for what felt like miles before finally slowing to a halt only when the sound of the footsteps behind me subsided. I ended up near a dimly lit dive bar on the wrong side of town and decided to head in for a drink because, Jesus, after that night, wouldn't you? And that takes me to where I am now, sipping on a vodka soda, sitting here typing this all out, recounting the past few weeks that have been nothing but complete chaos. I was lucky enough to have had my phone in my back pocket when the whole situation with my roommate went down. I'm surprised it didn't fly out as I ran for my life down the streets of DC. I don't know what to do. I can't call the police. I'll sound like a complete lunatic. Regardless, I know what I saw. I know there's something seriously wrong. The only upside of this night is that during the time I took to write this out, someone must have noticed how troubled I looked and ordered me another vodka soda because now there are two sitting in front of me. I was 17 when my dad died of heart failure. I woke up that morning to the sound of my mom crying and I knew right away what was wrong. He'd been sick for years and his own father had died the night before in the same way. According to my mom, my dad died with a smile on his face. At least his last moments may have been happy because he was not a happy man in life. He was grumpy and mean and the type who always had to get his way. I still loved him, but in all honesty, I was relieved when he died. He was blind and mentally ill. He was suffering the entire time I knew him. He smoked, listened to audiobooks, and told my brother and me stories. There wasn't much else. Where I live, there's a program where the blind can borrow audiobooks through the mail. The tapes are chipped so they can only be played on the machines the program sends out. He never learned Braille, so when the tapes came in, I'd sort them so he knew which was which and read the information on the card to him, then I'd send the old tapes back. All I had to do was turn the information card on the case over, bundle them with a rubber band, and stick them in the mailbox. The day after my dad passed, a bundle of tapes came in the mail. They were all his favorite authors. I don't know why I kept them for as long as I did, but a month after they came, I turned the card over and sent them back with a note that the man they were for was deceased. No more tapes came to that house and no one asked for the player back. Even when things with my family went downhill and I was moving every few months trying to get stable, I held on to that machine. I got the first tape 2 years ago, just days after moving into the home I'm currently renting. It took a while to get on my feet, but I was finally living on my own with a stable job and a cheap little moped to get around town on. When I pulled the familiar gray case out of the mailbox, my first thought was the former tenant must have been blind. I took it inside, planning to write a note on the card like I did before when I realized there wasn't a return address. I turned the card back over and blinked in confusion. My father's name was on the card. For some strange reason, my dead dad's name was on the card of the tape delivered to my address. I tried to contact the program to see what was up. They claimed not to have any record of sending it. After I battered them for a couple minutes, they asked which audiobook it was. I checked the card again and realized it didn't say. The cards were supposed to have the title, author, and narrator printed on the front, but there wasn't any of that. I told the person on the phone and they sighed, told me they didn't send it, and hung up. Swearing, I opened up the case and a slip of paper fell out. I reached down to grab it, but before I could reach it, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. The call was from a hospital a few states away. My mother had been traveling with a carnival when she suffered a stroke. My older brother was MIA and wanted nothing to do with her, so the next few months were full between taking care of my mother and trying to stay afloat financially. I forgot about the tape until 6 months later when another came. Same situation. The card was addressed to my father with no return address. I tried to play the tape to see what was on it, but the machine wouldn't power on. The cord was broken, but it could also be powered by a battery. I told myself I'd get some batteries, threw both tapes and the player into a drawer, and forgot about them. By then, my mother was as recovered as she might ever be. She couldn't live alone because she couldn't cook or drive, so I added her to the lease. I really didn't want to since we'd been on bad terms before the stroke, but I couldn't bear to abandon her. Maybe I should have. A week ago, another tape came. I showed her the case, but she had no idea what it was. At first, I chalked it up to the memory loss she'd been experiencing. The stroke hit her hard. She couldn't remember anything about me or our family for a long time, and she had trouble moving like she used to. Her limbs moved awkwardly, and she had to learn how to use her body all over again. I had to help her do pretty much everything at first, and in some ways, it felt like she died, and the woman living with me wasn't my mother anymore. I went to the store yesterday and bought a pack of batteries. After my mother went to bed, I grabbed the tapes and the player and went to my bedroom. Maybe the tapes were similar to what my dad liked to listen to, and it would give her something to do during the day other than watch TV. I thought that maybe a story she'd heard in passing would jog her memory. I put the batteries in the player and it powered on. Smiling, I grabbed one of the tapes and pushed it in, but no sound came out. The speakers were busted. Determined to finally find out more about these tapes and prove that I was right and the program had sent them, I dug out some headphones, plugged them in, and hit play. At first, all I heard was soft sobbing and rustling. Did someone record over the book? It couldn't be an accident. Was someone messing with me? My brother? After a few seconds, a woman's voice screamed for help. I paused the tape. It sounded like my mother. Deciding that was ridiculous, I hit play. There were only a few minutes of audio on the tape. It sounded like someone running and screaming for help before being caught. I sat there while silence played for a few seconds, thinking how odd it was. Maybe it was an audio drama? Where were the credits? I swapped one tape for the next. This one was an entire audiobook about stroke victims. I sped through it, and it seemed to be a guide for family members. It went over recovery, support, anything a family member might want to know. I shook my head and moved on to the third tape. This one had only a few seconds of audio, but I listened to it over and over again, not really believing what I'd heard. It was my parents talking. How had anyone caught this? Who would send it to me? Why go through the trouble of putting it on one of those specialty tapes? It must have been recorded during one of those nights where they'd sit and talk about life. My mother asked, "Do you remember what color my eyes are?" My father replied, "Of course I do. My favorite shade of blue." It didn't make any sense. I knew it would bother me my whole life, but at the end of the night, I shoved the tapes and player into the back of the closet. I didn't plan to ever dig them out again. If any more tapes came, I'd throw them back there with the rest without listening to them. This morning, I got up early. I couldn't get back to sleep, so I decided to clean the kitchen. I happened to knock a sauce bottle behind the fridge. Groaning, I pushed it forward a few inches and knelt to look for the bottle. I grabbed it and paused when I saw a slip of paper lying face up with a simple handwritten message. "Do you remember what color my eyes are?" I grabbed it and pushed the fridge back in place. I threw the note in the trash, hoping to forget about it. My mother woke up a few hours later. I brought her breakfast, and she thanked me. Her hands still shook as she lifted the spoon to her mouth. I couldn't help but notice that her eyes were brown. She's been watching TV in the living room. I told her I needed some documents for tax paperwork and looked through file folders and wallets for old IDs, a birth certificate, anything with eye color. I want to believe I'm being silly, that there's just no way the woman I've been living with and caring for isn't my mother, but every single document says blue.